You think the 1970s was all avocado green appliances and shag carpets. Think again. These suburban kitchens served up some of the most creative, economical, and surprisingly satisfying ground beef dishes in American culinary history. Their real recipes served to real families across America during an era of economic uncertainty, gas shortages, and skyrocketing grocery prices. Let's dig into 25 ground beef recipes from the 1970s that kept families fed, happy, and coming back for seconds even when times were tough. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. This Depression-era holdover became a 1970s lifesaver when beef prices jumped 30% during the early recession. Working-class families from Ohio to Oregon stretched a single pound of ground beef to feed 6 people, and hamburger gravy was their secret weapon. You'd brown the meat in a cast-iron skillet, then create a roux right in that beef fat, stirring in flour until it turned golden. Milk went in next, transforming into a thick, peppery gravy studded with meat. Ladled over a mountain of buttery mashed potatoes, this dish hit your stomach like comfort in a bowl. It meant something beyond nutrition. It meant mom could make dinner happen even when dad's paycheck didn't stretch as far. The gravy soaked into those potatoes, creating pockets of savory richness that made you forget you were eating a budget meal. Today's trendy elevated comfort food wishes it had this kind of soul. And if you're enjoying this trip down memory lane through America's forgotten ground beef recipes, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next culinary time capsule. We've got decades of forgotten foods to uncover together. Porcupine meatballs. Don't let the name fool you. No actual porcupines were harmed in 1970s kitchens. These meatballs got their quirky name from the white rice mixed into the ground beef that poked out during cooking, looking like tiny quills. Popular in church potlucks and PTA dinners across Middle America, porcupine meatballs were the dish that brought communities together. You'd combine ground beef with uncooked rice, minced onion, and a beaten egg, rolling them into golf ball-sized spheres. The magic happened when you nestled them into a thick tomato sauce made from Campbell's condensed soup. Nobody used fresh tomatoes when a can cost $29. As they simmered on the stovetop, the rice absorbed the tomato liquid, expanding and pushing through the meat. The result was tender meatballs with a unique texture somewhere between a stuffed pepper and a meatloaf. They represented American ingenuity, taking 2 cheap ingredients and creating something that felt special enough for Sunday supper. Tater tot casserole. Here's where 1970s convenience culture reached its glorious peak. Tater tot casserole, affectionately called hot dish in Minnesota, combined 3 ingredients Americans couldn't get enough of: ground beef cream of mushroom soup and those golden frozen potato cylinders. Invented by Oida in 1953, tater tots became the crown jewel of casserole cooking by the 70s. The assembly was pure simplicity. Brown your beef with onions, spread it in a 9x13 pan, blanket it with condensed soup straight from the can, then create a geometric pattern of frozen tots across the top. 40 minutes in a 350-degree oven transform this into a bubbling masterpiece with crispy topped tots and creamy beefy filling underneath. The sound of your fork breaking through that crunchy potato crust into the savory center was the dinner bell of a generation. It showed up at every church basement, potluck, every funeral reception, every neighborhood gathering. Fancy never. Delicious absolutely. If this casserole represented American efficiency, why complicate dinner when processed perfection was this easy old-school goulash, American chop suey? Every Midwestern grandmother had her version of this skillet meal, though calling it goulash would make a Hungarian chef weep. This was American chop suey, the one-pot wonder that saved weeknight dinners when mom worked late. Born in school cafeterias during the post-war years, it exploded in home kitchens during the economically strapped 1970s. You'd brown ground beef with diced onions until everything caramelized together. Then dump in elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were hiding in the crisper drawer. Everything cooked together in one skillet. The pasta soaking up those tomatoey beefy juices until it turned soft and flavor-packed. The beauty was its flexibility. Green peppers if you had them, corn if you didn't, maybe some shredded cheese on top if payday was recent. It bubbled away on the stovetop, filling the house with that familiar savory aroma that meant dinner was almost ready. This wasn't fine dining. This was survival cooking that somehow tasted like home. Beef and cabbage skillet. When grocery budgets got tight in the mid-1970s, cabbage became the unsung hero of American kitchens. At 15 cents a pound, this humble vegetable could bulk up a half pound of ground beef into a meal for 5. Irish and German immigrants had brought cabbage traditions to America generations earlier, but the 70s recession made it mainstream across every ethnic background. You'd start by browning ground beef with onions in your trusty electric skillet. That avocado-colored wedding gift, getting daily use. Once the meat rendered its fat in, went thick wedges of cabbage sizzling and wilting in the beef drippings, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, some salt and pepper, maybe a can of tomatoes if you were feeling flush. The cabbage cooked down into sweet, tender ribbons that absorbed every bit of meaty flavor, transforming from cheap vegetables into something that tasted rich and satisfying. It hit the table steaming hot, often with a side of buttered white bread for soaking up the juices. Nutritionists today would call this a one-pan wonder. Back then it was just called making it work. Beef and macaroni skillet. Before Hamburger Helper became a household name in 1971, home cooks were already mixing ground beef with macaroni in cast-iron skillets across America. This recipe was the original helper, stretching meat with pasta and whatever sauce you could improvise. The 1970s version became a weeknight staple because everything happened in one pan. Less cleanup meant more time for your second job or community college night classes. You'd get the beef sizzling first, breaking it into crumbles with a wooden spoon scarred from years of use. Garlic powder went in. Fresh garlic was still exotic in most American suburbs. Then came elbow macaroni beef broth, or bouillon cubes dissolved in water, and a generous pour of ketchup or tomato sauce. The magic was in letting it all simmer together. The pasta cooking directly in that beefy liquid, absorbing every molecule of flavor. When the macaroni turned tender, you'd stir in a handful of shredded cheddar that melted into stringy, gooey pockets throughout. It was simple, quick, and filled bellies without emptying wallets. That was the 1970s kitchen promise, delivered in 30 minutes. Chipwreck casserole. With a name straight out of a church cookbook, chipwreck casserole earned its spot on 1970s tables through sheer audacity. Someone looked at ground beef, crushed potato chips, and condensed soup and thought, let's bake this together. The result was polarizing but undeniably popular at potlucks from Texas to Michigan. The architecture was simple but specific. Brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup created the foundation. You'd layer this in a casserole dish. Then comes the controversial part. An entire bag of crushed potato chips mixed throughout and piled on top. Cheese was optional but encouraged, usually the orange kind that came pre-shredded in a bag. Into the oven it went, emerging with those chips somehow transformed. The ones on top stayed crunchy while the ones inside turned into salty, starchy pockets that absorbed the creamy sauce. Every bite was a texture adventure. Crispy, creamy, meaty, and absurdly indulgent. Nutritionists weren't invited to 1970s potlucks, and chipwreck casserole was living proof. It represented an era when processed foods weren't the enemy. They were the exciting future of American cooking. Meatloaf muffins. Somebody in the 1970s had a brilliant realization. Meatloaf took forever to bake, but muffin-sized portions would cook in a fraction of the time. Thus, meatloaf muffins were born. Perfect for busy families racing between soccer practice and Tupperware parties. You'd mix ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, eggs, diced onions, and enough ketchup to make the mixture slightly sweet. But instead of packing it into a loaf pan for an hour-long bake, you'd scoop it into greased muffin tins, creating individual portions that cooked in just 25 minutes. The genius was in the surface area. Each muffin developed a caramelized crust all the way around. Unlike traditional meatloaf that only got crispy on the outside edges, kids loved them because they felt like personal-sized dinners. And Mom loved them because you could freeze extras for emergency meals. They'd emerge from the oven with their tops glazed in a ketchup-brown sugar mixture that turned sticky and slightly charred. Served with instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans, this was efficiency eating at its finest. The 1970s didn't slow down for anyone, and neither did dinner. Beef and biscuit ring. This recipe looked impressive enough for company but was secretly easy enough for a Tuesday night, making it perfect for the aspirational 1970s homemaker. The presentation was pure vintage showmanship. Ground beef baked in the center of a Pillsbury biscuit ring, emerging from the oven looking like something from a magazine. You'd brown ground beef with onions and seasonings. Maybe add some corn or green beans for color and vegetables. While that cooled slightly, you'd arrange refrigerated biscuit dough in a circle on a baking sheet, overlapping slightly to create a connected ring. The beef mixture got spooned into the center. Then you'd fold the biscuit edges over the filling, leaving the middle exposed. 30 minutes at 375, and you had a golden flaky ring with savory beef filling peeking through. The biscuits absorbed some of that beef juice, turning tender and flavorful. When you brought this to the table, it looked like you'd spent hours on dinner. The secret 15 minutes of actual work stayed between you and the empty Pillsbury tube in the trash. This was 1970s entertaining. Impressive results through convenient shortcuts. No apologies necessary. Porcupine rice bake. While porcupine meatballs simmered on the stovetop, their cousin porcupine rice bake took the concept to the oven for a more hands-off approach. Perfect for the working mothers, increasingly common in 1970s America, this casserole required assembly time but no babysitting while it cooked. The principle remained the same. Uncooked rice mixed directly into the ground beef created those characteristic quills poking out, but instead of forming individual meatballs, you'd press the mixture into a casserole dish, making it faster to assemble. The baking liquid was key. Tomato soup thinned with water, or if you were feeling fancy, a mixture of tomato sauce and beef bouillon. The casserole baked covered for an hour. The rice slowly absorbing liquid and swelling, pushing through the meat layer like an edible pincushion. What made this version special was the top. Uncovered for the final 15 minutes, it developed a slightly crusty caramelized surface that added textural contrast. Served with a simple salad and some garlic bread, this was the kind of meal that made you look like you had it all together even when you were juggling 2 jobs and 3 kids. Beef jambalaya bake. The 1970s saw Americans experimenting with exotic regional cuisines, though filtered through a Midwestern sensibility. Beef jambalaya bake was what happened when Louisiana's complex rice dish met the convenience culture of suburban casserole cooking. Traditional jambalaya's long process got streamlined into a 45-minute bake that still captured some Creole spirit, even if purists would call it heresy. You'd brown ground beef with the holy trinity: bell peppers, onions, and celery, though many recipes suggested using dried onion flakes instead. Canned tomatoes went in along with white rice. And here's where the 1970s showed up. Instead of stock and careful seasoning, most recipes called for a packet of Lipton onion soup mix. Everything went into a casserole dish with enough water to cook the rice, then baked covered until the grains turned tender. The result wasn't authentic New Orleans cooking, but it was spicy, hearty, and different enough from the usual rotation to feel adventurous. It represented American food culture's simultaneous curiosity about regional cooking and unwillingness to abandon convenience. Served with a side of cornbread, it brought a taste of Louisiana to kitchens that had never seen the Mississippi. Hamburger biscuit bake. Here was another marriage of ground beef and refrigerated biscuit dough, but with a different personality than the biscuit ring. Hamburger biscuit bake layered everything into a casserole dish, creating a complete meal where fluffy biscuits absorbed savory beef juices from below. The 1970s loved this formula. Convenience products elevated through clever assembly. You'd start with brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom soup, maybe some frozen mixed vegetables for color and virtue. This went into a 9x13 pan, spreading evenly across the bottom. Then came the fun part, tearing those refrigerated biscuits into quarters and arranging them across the top like a savory cobbler. Some recipes called for brushing the biscuit pieces with melted butter and sprinkling them with garlic powder details that separated good cooks from great ones. As it baked, the biscuits puffed up into golden clouds while their bottoms soaked in the creamy beef mixture below. The contrast was irresistible. Crispy, buttery tops with soft gravy-soaked undersides. This was comfort food geometry. Each element perfectly positioned to enhance the others. It proved you didn't need culinary school. You just needed an understanding of how flavors and textures could work together. Mock prime rib patties. The mock trend of the 1970s reached peak aspiration with mock prime rib patties. Ground beef dressed up to feel luxurious during economically tight times. When actual prime rib cost a week's grocery budget home, cooks created recipes that captured the essence without the expense. These weren't just hamburgers. They were an attitude. You'd mix ground beef with breadcrumbs, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and the secret ingredient liquid smoke. That bottled smoke flavor was a 1970s kitchen staple, bringing campfire authenticity to suburban stovetops. The beef got formed into thick patties, seared in a hot skillet until crusty and brown, then finished with a sauce made from condensed mushroom soup, thinned with red wine or beef broth. The presentation mattered. These weren't served on buns, but plated like steaks, maybe with roasted potatoes and canned asparagus on the side. When you cut into them, they weren't medium rare like real prime rib, but that charred crust and savory sauce created enough theater to feel special. They appeared at anniversary dinners, birthday celebrations, any occasion that deserved something beyond everyday cooking. Nobody was fooled, but that wasn't the point. These patties represented dignity when budgets couldn't afford luxury. Beef and potato hash casserole. Breakfast for dinner became increasingly popular in the economically strained 1970s, and beef and potato hash casserole brought that concept to its logical conclusion. This was cowboy cooking meets suburban convenience, with ground beef replacing the traditional corned beef hash and frozen hash browns replacing fresh potatoes. Speed was the selling point. The entire dish went from package to oven in under 10 minutes. You'd mix brown ground beef with thawed hash browns, cream of celery soup, sour cream, and shredded cheddar cheese. Everything combined in a casserole dish topped with crushed cornflakes mixed with melted butter for crunch. An hour in the oven transformed these humble ingredients into a golden, bubbling mass that smelled like Saturday morning and tasted like pure comfort. The hash browns turned creamy inside with crispy edges. The beef added heartiness, and that cornflake topping provided the textural contrast that made every bite interesting. Families served this with fried eggs on top for actual breakfast-dinner fusion or alone as a one-dish meal. It reflected the 1970s breakdown of food rules. If something tasted good and saved time, who cared what meal it was supposed to be? Beef tamale pie. Despite its religious-sounding name, beef tamale pie had nothing to do with worship and everything to do with architectural cooking. This was basically shepherd's pie's American cousin made with ground beef instead of lamb and loaded with corn because Americans put corn in everything during the 1970s. The name came from its temple-like structure. Meat and vegetables on the bottom, mashed potatoes rising on top like a dome. You'd brown ground beef with onions, add frozen mixed vegetables or just corn and peas, then bind everything with beef gravy made from flour beef bouillon and the drippings. This filling went into a deep pie dish or casserole pan, creating the foundation. Then came the mashed potatoes, leftover or instant nobody judged, spread thick across the top and decorated with fork tines, creating ridges that would catch the heat. A pat of butter on top helped it brown beautifully. When it emerged from the oven, that potato layer had transformed into a golden crust with fluffy interior protecting the bubbling savory filling below. Breaking through that potato roof into the beefy interior was deeply satisfying. It fed a family of 4 for under $3, making it both architectural achievement and economic necessity. Hamburger spoonbread casserole. Spoonbread, that southern specialty somewhere between cornbread and pudding, met ground beef in this unlikely but successful 1970s fusion. Southern cooks had been making spoonbread for generations, but pairing it with hamburger meat was pure American casserole innovation. This dish confused categories in the best way. Was it a main dish with cornbread on top or cornbread with meat mixed in? The answer was yes. You'd make a cornmeal batter with milk, eggs, butter, and baking powder, creating something pourable rather than firm. Brown ground beef mixed with sautéed onions and maybe some diced green chilies went into a buttered casserole dish first. Then the cornmeal batter got poured over the top where it would settle around the meat and create an almost soufflé-like texture as it baked. The result was spectacular. The spoonbread puffed up golden and slightly crusty on top, while underneath the meat and cornbread melted into a spoonable mixture that was part casserole, part cornbread dressing. Southerners recognized their heritage in the spoonbread, while Midwesterners embraced the casserole format. Homemade sloppy joes. Yes, manwich existed in the 1970s, making it possible to open a can and call it dinner. But homemade sloppy joes were a point of pride for cooks who refused to surrender completely to convenience culture. This was the recipe passed down from older siblings who'd eaten them in school cafeterias, now recreated at home with more meat and less mystery. The base was simple. Brown your ground beef with diced onions and green peppers until everything caramelized together, creating a savory foundation. Then came the sauce. Ketchup as the sweet, tangy base, brown sugar for extra sweetness, yellow mustard for tang, Worcestershire sauce for depth, and a splash of vinegar to cut through the richness. Some cooks added tomato paste for thickness or hot sauce for kick. The mixture simmered on the stovetop until it reduced to a sloppy but not soup-like consistency, hence the name that made elementary school kids giggle. Spooned onto soft hamburger buns that immediately started disintegrating, these sandwiches were messy by design. You needed napkins, lots of them, to handle the beef mixture that dripped down your hands with every bite. Served with potato chips and pickles, sloppy joes were weekend lunch perfection. Casual food that brought families together around the table without fuss or formality. Beef enchilada casserole. The 1970s discovered Mexican food, or at least a Midwestern interpretation of it. Beef enchilada casserole was what happened when Americans took enchiladas apart, reassembled them in a casserole dish, and made them easier for Tuesday night dinner. No individual rolling, required just layers that delivered similar flavors with a fraction of the effort. You'd start by browning ground beef with a packet of taco seasoning. Old El Paso and Lori's were fighting for market dominance in suburban pantries. Canned enchilada sauce came next, mild enough that kids wouldn't protest. Then, the assembly. Corn tortillas cut into strips created layers alternating with the beef mixture, canned refried beans, and shredded cheese, usually cheddar since authentic Mexican cheeses weren't available in most supermarkets. The casserole baked until bubbling and golden, the tortilla strips softening into something between chips and noodles. Topped with sour cream, shredded lettuce, chopped tomatoes, and sliced black olives from a can, it looked impressive and tasted like family taco night without the assembly line. This represented America's growing interest in ethnic cuisines filtered through convenience culture. Was it authentic Mexican cooking? Not remotely. Did families love it anyway? Absolutely. It brought new flavors to conservative palates while staying safely within comfort zones. Beef and bean burrito bake. Following close behind the enchilada casserole came beef and bean burrito bake, another deconstructed Mexican dish made Midwest-friendly. The 1970s loved burritos as a concept. Everything wrapped up in one tortilla, but rolling dozens for a family dinner felt labor-intensive. This casserole delivered burrito flavors in a format that served 8 from one pan. The filling started with ground beef and taco seasoning, America's gateway to spice, then added canned pinto or refried beans for protein and bulk. The original method involved actually rolling these fillings into flour tortillas and arranging them in a casserole dish. But the lazier version, beloved by working mothers, just layered everything flat. Tortillas on bottom, beef and bean mixture cheese, more tortillas, more filling topped with enchilada sauce and a final blanket of cheese. The oven transformed this into a lasagna-like structure where the tortillas softened into pasta-like layers. The top got slightly crispy while everything underneath stayed tender and saucy. Cutting into it revealed those distinct layers, making each serving look like a slice of Tex-Mex cake. It appeared at potlucks, church suppers, and neighborhood gatherings, always disappearing fast. This was cultural exchange through casserole dishes, Americans adapting borrowed flavors into familiar formats. Beef stuffed peppers. Stuffed peppers had been around for generations, but the 1970s version streamlined everything, making them accessible for weeknight cooking rather than special occasions. This recipe appeared in every community cookbook from Oregon to Florida, with minor variations reflecting regional preferences but maintaining the same basic architecture. You'd have bell peppers lengthwise, removing seeds and membranes to create edible boats. These got parboiled briefly so they'd finish cooking in time with the filling. The stuffing mixture combined brown ground beef with cooked rice, usually minute rice for speed, canned tomato sauce, diced onions, and whatever seasonings your family preferred. Italian seasoning packets were popular, or garlic powder and oregano from the spice rack. The pepper halves got stuffed full, arranged upright in a baking dish with a little water in the bottom to create steam. They baked until the peppers turned tender and slightly charred at the edges, the filling bubbling out the top. The final touch was mandatory. Shredded mozzarella melted across the top during the last 10 minutes. Each pepper became an individual serving, making portion control automatic. They looked elegant enough for company but were practical enough for family dinner. Nutritionists loved them because vegetables were the container, making this one of the healthier 1970s options that still satisfied meat and potatoes sensibilities. Sloppy Joe pie. When regular Sloppy Joes weren't fancy enough for Sunday dinner, but the budget couldn't handle a real roast, creative cooks invented Sloppy Joe pie. This clever dish took the familiar flavors of the sandwich filling and dressed them up with a cornbread topping that made everything feel more special. The base started like any good Sloppy Joe. Ground beef browned with onions, then seasoned with ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, and a touch of brown sugar for that sweet, tangy flavor kids couldn't resist. But instead of piling it on hamburger buns, the mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with cornbread batter made from a simple box mix or scratch ingredients. As it baked, something magical happened. The cornbread rose and turned golden while absorbing just enough of the beef juices to stay moist and flavorful. The result looked like a proper dinner that could grace any table even when unexpected company showed up. Served with a simple salad or canned green beans, this dish could make any family feel like they were dining in style regardless of what was actually in the bank account. Chipwreck casserole. The name tells you everything you need to know about this recipe. It was born from desperation and whatever happened to be in the pantry. When grocery money ran out before payday, mothers would survey their kitchens and create miracles from seemingly nothing. Chipwreck casserole became legendary because it combined the irresistible crunch of potato chips with hearty ground beef in a way that made everyone forget they were eating leftovers. Ground beef was stretched with whatever vegetables were available, often canned corn, green beans, or diced tomatoes. The mixture was seasoned with onion soup, mix, a pantry staple that added flavor without fresh ingredients, and maybe a can of cream soup to bind everything together. The magic happened on top, where crushed potato chips created a golden, crunchy layer that children would fight over. This dish proved that sometimes the best recipes come from having no choice but to be creative. Families would request it even during better times because it tasted like childhood, like making do, like the satisfaction of turning nothing into something delicious. The name stuck because everyone knew what it meant. Good food made from whatever didn't get wrecked in your kitchen. Salisbury steak. Before frozen TV dinners made this dish a pale imitation of itself. Salisbury steak was a masterpiece of stretching meat into something special, named after Dr. James Salisbury, who believed in the power of beef for good health. This recipe became a staple because it made 1 pound of ground beef look and taste like expensive steaks. The trick was in the binding. Breadcrumbs, egg, and a splash of milk transformed ordinary ground beef into individual portions that looked substantial on the plate. Shaped by hand into oval patties, these were pan-fried until golden brown, then set aside while onions cooked down into sweet, caramelized perfection. The gravy was built right in the same pan using the beef drippings and flour to create a rich brown sauce that made everything taste like Sunday dinner. Smart housewives would make extra patties and freeze them for quick meals later in the week. The children thought they were getting steak for dinner, and in a way they were just not the kind that came from the butcher's expensive cuts. This was working-class steak made with love and necessity in equal measure. Corn chip beef bake. Sometimes the best recipes came from happy accidents. Corn chip beef bake was likely born when someone decided to use up a bag of stale corn chips instead of throwing them away. What started as a desperate measure became a family favorite that combined the familiar flavors of tacos with the comfort of a hot casserole. Ground beef was browned and seasoned with whatever Mexican-inspired spices were available: chili powder, cumin, or sometimes just a packet of taco seasoning if the budget allowed. Canned beans, corn, and diced tomatoes stretched the meat and added nutrition. The mixture went into a casserole dish and was topped with crushed corn chips and whatever cheese could be spared. As it baked, the corn chips created a crunchy topping that contrasted beautifully with the tender beef mixture underneath. The cheese melted and bubbled, creating an irresistible golden layer that made everyone forget this dish was born from using up pantry scraps. Served with a simple lettuce and tomato salad, it felt like a fiesta, even when there was little to celebrate. It proved that sometimes the best innovations come from making do with what you have. Ketchup-glazed meat patties. Ketchup was more than just a condiment. It was a cooking ingredient that could transform simple ground beef patties into something that tasted like they'd been slow-cooked for hours. The secret was in creating a glaze that caramelized during cooking, adding both flavor and visual appeal to an otherwise plain dish. The patties themselves were kept simple. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and basic seasonings then formed into individual portions. But the magic happened with the glaze made from ketchup, brown sugar vinegar, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire sauce. This mixture was brushed over the patties before cooking, and again during the cooking process, building up layers of sweet, tangy flavor. As the patties cooked, the glaze caramelized and created a beautiful mahogany coating that made them look expensive and sophisticated. The flavor was complex, sweet, tangy, and savory all at once, despite being made from ingredients that cost almost nothing. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, these patties could anchor a meal that felt special enough for Sunday dinner while staying within even the tightest budget. Rag mop casserole. The name came from the appearance of the noodles mixed throughout the casserole, which resembled the strands of an old-fashioned rag mop. This dish became popular because it used broken or leftover pasta, turning what might have been waste into the foundation for a hearty family meal. Ground beef was browned with onions and mixed with whatever pasta was available, often broken spaghetti elbow macaroni or egg noodles that were past their prime. Canned tomatoes and tomato sauce created the base, while cream of mushroom soup added richness and helped bind everything together. The mixture was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were growing in the kitchen garden. Baked until bubbly and topped with cheese, if the budget allowed, the casserole was filling, flavorful, and satisfying in a way that made everyone forget it was made from leftovers and scraps. The pasta absorbed the beef and tomato flavors while contributing its own hearty texture. Families could eat this for several meals, and it often improved with time as the flavors melted together. It was resourceful cooking that turned potential waste into something delicious and nourishing. Midwest meat pie. Meat pies were traditional comfort food that could stretch a small amount of meat into a meal that felt substantial and satisfying. The Midwest version was especially practical because it used ingredients that were readily available in farming communities and could be prepared ahead of time for busy families. Ground beef was browned with onions and mixed with diced potatoes, carrots, and whatever other vegetables were available. The mixture was seasoned simply and placed in a pie crust, often homemade from flour shortening and water. A top crust sealed in all the flavors and created an attractive presentation that made the meal feel special and complete. The finished pie could be cut into wedges that provided individual portions, making it easy to serve and making portion control natural. The crust absorbed some of the meat juices while cooking, creating a flavorful bottom layer that added to the overall satisfaction of the meal. Families could prepare these pies ahead of time and bake them when needed, making dinner preparation more efficient during busy periods. It was practical cooking that delivered both nutrition and comfort in every slice. Beef and potato casserole. Ah, the classic beef and potato casserole. This was the kind of dish that asked for nothing fancy and still delivered everything a hungry family needed. Layers of browned ground beef, tender potatoes, a creamy sauce, and a generous blanket of cheese could warm even the coldest evening. It was simple, hearty, and built for real life. No complicated steps, no expensive ingredients, just reliable comfort in one pan. Maybe that is why it quietly faded from the spotlight. New recipes chased trends, but this casserole stayed exactly what it had always been: filling, affordable, and deeply satisfying. It was the kind of meal that made seconds feel inevitable and leftovers feel like a reward. For busy families, it was perfect. Less cleanup, less stress, and more time to sit down together. Beef tamale pie. The tamale has roots stretching back centuries, but tamale pie became a distinctly American shortcut version that fit beautifully into the 1970s kitchen. Instead of mesa wrapped and steamed, this version layered seasoned ground beef corn sauce and a cornbread-style topping into one easy bake. By the middle of the century, cooks had started adding whatever made the dish more generous and more colorful. Corn olives, green peppers, even cheese found their way in. Nobody can say for certain who first turned it into this casserole classic, but it feels like the kind of idea that could only come from a place where culture's ingredients and practicality all met at the dinner table. Hamburger soup. At first the name sounds a little strange, but once you picture it, it makes perfect sense. Ground beef, vegetables, and a rich broth simmered together into a bowl of pure cold weather comfort. It had the heartiness of a full meal, but it stretched a small amount of meat far enough to feed everyone. Carrots, onions, celery, tomatoes, maybe a handful of barley or pasta, all of it came together in a pot that smelled like home. And like so many great budget meals, it tasted even better the next day. Hamburger soup wasn't flashy. It was practical, nourishing, and endlessly flexible. Exactly the kind of recipe that earned a permanent spot in the family rotation. Beef chili. Few dishes have the staying power of a good pot of beef chili. Grandma's version may have been simple, just ground beef, beans, tomatoes, and chili powder, but simplicity was part of the magic. It was bold, warming, affordable, and generous enough to feed a crowd without much fuss. Its roots may trace back to Texas, where early versions often skipped the beans, but the version most families came to know made room for them. Beans stretched the meal, added texture, and turned chili into an even better value. Every household had its own version, and every cook believed theirs was the right one. What made chili special was not just the flavor on the first night, but the way it deepened by the next day. The spices settled in, the broth thickened, and every bowl somehow tasted better than the last. It was perfect for cold evenings, game days, family gatherings, and those ordinary nights when everyone just needed something warm and filling. And that may be the real story behind all of these 1970s ground beef dishes. They were never just about what was cheap or easy. They were about stretching, adapting, improvising, and still putting something good on the table. In kitchens across America, ground beef became the foundation for meals that felt bigger than their ingredients. Some were humble, some were strange, some leaned hard on canned soup biscuit dough or frozen shortcuts, but all of them came from the same place. A generation of home cooks determined to feed their families with whatever they had and make it taste like care.